Hello everybody. Today I just want to sit down and take a few moments to talk about the differences between the two marks of the British Spitfire, the iconic British Spitfire that is found in the Battle of Bodenplatte and the Battle of Normandy extensions for the IL-2 Great Battle series. The first, and perhaps the most recognizable of these two aircraft, is the Mark IX, specifically in the LF Mark IX version. This one comes as part of the Battle of Bodenplatte extension, and it is among the most iconic of the British Spitfire marks. In 1942, the predominant variant of the Spitfire in service with the RAF and its sub-divisions from its territorial holdings, like the Royal Canadian Air Force, or the Royal New Zealand Air Force, or the Royal Australian Air Force, was the Mark V. However, 1942 saw the continued deployment of the FW-190A, the Anton, in ever-growing numbers to the Western Front, and when, over the English Channels, the Mark V tangled with the Anton, it found itself to be a lot more maneuverable, but less well-armed and ultimately a lot slower on the deck. The Anton, also known as the Butcher Bird, is itself an incredibly impressive and beautiful airplane that deserves its whole own video, and maybe at some point I'll do one talking about it in IL-2. But if you're curious more about how the airplane functioned on a mechanical side, I would suggest watching the video that I will put a little drop-down menu for from Greg's Airplanes and Automobiles. Greg does a phenomenal job of talking about how the aircraft worked mechanically, and it's a fascinating series that I highly recommend anybody watch. Anyway, back to the topic of the Spitfire, and specifically the lineage that led up to the Mark IX. In 1942, there was a high pressure on Supermarine, the manufacturer and designer of the Spitfire, to mount a new two-stage supercharged version of the Merlin engine onto the aircraft in order to overcome some of the performance gap that was existing between the Mark V and the 190 until the redesigned Mark VIII could come into service. The Mark VIII was a structural redesign of the Spitfire. It was more structurally sound, and it also had some of the control surfaces redesigned. For example, the vertical stabilizer was a lot more pointed compared to the V. However, because the aircraft was having to be wholly redesigned internally, it wasn't ready in time to meet the growing threat of the continuously rising numbers of FW-190s. Fun fact, that tail is a really good way of telling a converted earlier mark from a specifically built Mark IX. For example, a converted V that has now been made into a Mark IX is going to have that rounded tail, while a specifically built Mark IX is going to have the more pointed vertical stabilizer that was introduced on the Mark VIII. Now, that's not a all-encompassing rule. Some of the earlier Mark IXs that were specifically built as Mark IXs retained the rounded vertical stabilizer. However, as a general rule of thumb, it's a pretty good indicator. The early Mark IXs were really just Mark Vs that had had a Merlin 61 slammed into their nose instead of their original engine, and they lacked any of the later refinements that would be found in the purebred versions of the Mark IX. Ultimately, because the Mark VIII and the Mark IX use the same engines, those being the Merlin 63, the Merlin 66, and the Merlin 70, and because performance between the two was relatively comparable, but the Mark IX was cheaper to build and could be converted from existing airframes early on, it ended up being produced in a higher number than the Mark VIII, second only in terms of Spitfire production to the Mark V. This leads us to 1C's depiction of the Spitfire Mark IX as included in the Battle of Bodenplatte extension. 1C listed as a Spitfire Mark IXE, and that, I think, is their very clever way of getting around the fact that what they've given us isn't any specific one version of the Spitfire Mark IX, but can be modded out to be several. In its base form, the Spitfire in IL-2 Battle of Bodenplatte is a LF Mark IX. It uses, by default, the Merlin 66 engine, which was adapted in late 1943 for the LF variant of the Spitfire. That was the version of the Spitfire Mark IX geared towards low altitude performance. The E after the Mark number denotes that the aircraft is using the E-type wing, mounting two Hispano 20mm cannons in the outboard bays and two Browning 50 caliber machine guns in the inboard bays. Interestingly enough, sometimes in documentation, These aircraft, the Spitfire Mark 9s using the E-type wing, are denoted as Mark 9.5s. That's simply a designation that the RAF used prior to coming up with the E-type designation for the wing. It doesn't mean that it's some sort of special block, it just means that it has the E-type wing. Now, because the Mark 9 doesn't get the option to add any of the other wing types that it historically carried earlier on or towards the middle parts of the war, when used in a 1943 scenario, the current Spitfire is a bit ahistorical. However, it does get certain modifications. For example, some of these are quality of life, like the addition of an external mirror over the cockpit that gives much better rearward visibility, and some of them are performance-based, like the addition of 150 octane fuel and the swapping out of the Merlin 66 for the Merlin 70 engine, which makes the aircraft from an LF, a low-altitude optimized fighter version, to an HF, a high-altitude optimized fighter version. While the HF version of the Mark 9 is certainly playable in the 1943 scenarios and can be used through the spring 1944 ones, by the summer of 1944, I find that the aircraft tends to be in a unique situation. You see a lot more of other high-altitude aircraft that are going to offer a lot better performance. For example, a P-51D or an FW-190 Dora is going to far outclass you in terms of horsepower output at your ideal altitude, and it's going to far outclass you in terms of energy output and in terms of top speed. And you're going to find that the HF fits into this very weird and unfortunate bracket where it's no longer good enough at the altitude it's tuned to go for, and you can't bring it to the deck because it's not tuned for down there either, and you're going to find yourself very slow compared to everything else. As such, after the D-Day scenarios, I would recommend just leaning into the aircraft in its configuration that it comes in by default, and that being the LF version, the low altitude optimized version. Especially once you get access to the 150 octane fuel, the aircraft is incredibly competitive at low altitudes. If you want a little bit more roll rate, you can modify it with clipped wings. If you want to just keep that really good turn rate that the Spitfire has, you can keep it in the full elliptical wing. Now, I'm totally willing to make a separate video on how to fly the Mark 9 for people who are unaware of how to do that, but it's a pretty simple airplane to fly in terms of air combat maneuvering in it, and I'm kind of operating in this video under the assumption that people who are watching this have already flown the Mark 9, and because of that, they're letting it bleed into their flying of the Mark 14, and it's making their performance in the Mark 14 suffer. Let's move on to talking about the Mark 14. While still a Spitfire, the Mark 14 is a totally different beast from the Mark 9. It uses a Griffin engine instead of a Merlin engine. The Griffin engine was initially developed as a low-altitude geared engine for the Royal Navy, who wanted incredible low-altitude performance for whatever fighter they chose to put the Griffin into. Since the 1930s, there had always been an interest in putting the Griffin into, since the late 1930s, that is, into the Spitfire, because it would give the Spitfire a projected top speed of roughly 420 miles per hour, which was almost unprecedented at the time. However, there were speed bumps, the aircraft was geared towards low altitude performance, and by the time it was available in any kind of meaningful numbers, the Mark 9 had already kind of established itself as the primary low altitude fighter of the RAF, and because the early Griffin engines suffered at high altitude, those early Spitfires using the Griffin engines couldn't be put into high altitude service. Interesting fact, like the early Mark 9s, the early Mark 12s, which was the first mainstream production version of the Spitfire to use the Griffin, were often converted Mark 5s. Anyway, getting back on track. So Supermarine had to rectify this issue and add a second stage of supercharging onto the Griffin to give it better high altitude performance. Similar to the American Allison engine, it only had a single stage of supercharging, initially, and so it suffered at high altitudes. However, the Mark 14 rectified this by adding the Merlin 65 into the aircraft. This brought in a second stage of supercharger and brought much better high altitude performance. With the addition of a newer, bigger engine, the Mark 14 was lengthened by 10 centimeters compared to the previous Griffin version, the Mark 12, and it had several other changes made to the aircraft as well, including the redistribution of certain internal components, the redesign of the radiators under the wing, and the addition of a 5-bladed propeller. With the redesigns to the aircraft making it longer and the incorporation of the 5-bladed propeller using a larger propeller spinner, the aircraft has this sleek, eagle-like look that I just don't think is found in the other Spitfire marks, and to me makes it the most appealing and attractive of all of the aircraft's variants. It has this kind of Naboo starfighter-like look from Star Wars to me. I want to just briefly look at a couple of charts here and compare the nitty-gritty performance details of these two aircraft and their engines. And I won't go into these things in too, great of depth. I'll leave that for Greg and his phenomenal channel. But I just want to look at the difference in climb ratings, and then we'll look at the difference in speeds at given altitudes. So looking at a couple of RAF performance charts regarding the Mark 14 and the Mark 9, we can see that the Mark 14, until about 2,000 feet, climbs at roughly 52,000 feet per minute, and it then drops off pretty sharply until it gets to around 8,000 feet, at which point the aircraft sustains 3,600 feet per minute of climb rate up until roughly 22,000 feet, at which point it begins to drop off again. Let's then look at the performance chart for the Mark 19. We can see that the aircraft generally outperforms the Mark 14 in terms of climb rate and lower altitudes. At 8,000 feet, where the Mark 14 is doing 3,600, the Mark 9 is doing 4,000 feet per minute of climb rate. However, as that altitude passes over 10,000 feet, the climb rate of the Mark 9 falls off, while the Mark 14 stays consistent up until that 22,000 feet limit that we talked about earlier. You can see, for example, that at 16,000 feet, where the Mark 14 is doing 3,600, the Mark 9 is only doing roughly 2,700, and by 20,000 feet, the Mark 9 is only doing just barely over 2,000 feet per minute of climb. Just for a clarification, I'm using the line that's denoted by the 1, as that is the one that is most similar to the circumstances that the Mark 14 on the other sheet was tested under. Now I want to look at the speed differences, especially with comparison to altitude between these two aircraft, and please bear with me, this all has a relevance on how the aircraft plays in IL-2. So you can look at this one for the Mark 14, and they're both running under the same configuration, so 95% of takeoff weight with their radiator flaps closed. So you can see that under 12,000 feet, the aircraft doesn't really cap out over 380 miles per hour, and these are indicated airspeeds, by the way. However, that little joint where the first line meets the second line is where the second stage of supercharging kicks on, and you can really see the impact that has. After 12,000 feet, that speed begins to skyrocket, and it only goes up the farther up that airplane goes. By 20,000 feet, you're doing over 420 miles per hour. You're capping out at around 2,500 feet, doing just over 440. It's about 446 miles per hour, and after that, the airspeed drops off. Now I want to look at the Mark 9, and I apologize for how convoluted this chart is. It's a chart including multiple different airframes, all Mark 9s, all tested using 150 octane fuel, but there's slight discrepancies airframe to airframe. No two airplanes are exactly the same. However, we can see that on the lower end and at the lower altitudes, the Mark 9 holds with the Mark 14 relatively well. However, after 12,000 feet, the Mark 9 does gain speed as altitude goes up, but it doesn't gain speed at the rate that the Mark 14 does, and it caps out at a roughly 21,000 feet, going about 420 miles per hour. By the time that the Mark 9 reaches the ideal altitude of the Mark 14, it's going back at about 400 miles per hour, while the Mark 14 is going 440. Now, from those sheets, we can see that at lower altitudes, the aircraft are pretty comparable. I find that in IL-2, the Mark 14 is still faster on the deck, even though these performance sheets wouldn't indicate that it is. I also find that it accelerates a lot better on the deck than the Mark 9 does. However, what we can use these sheets for is to see how we want to play these aircraft. As you can see at the top of both of these sheets, the Mark 14 is a heavier airplane, and you can feel that in game. Many pilots of the Mark 14 in real life loved it because, you know, you could open the throttle all the way and just climb and climb and climb and climb. But they also said that it wasn't a traditional Spitfire in the maneuvering way, and it was heavier, and you couldn't feel the oncoming of a stall as easy. And that's true, you can't in game. However, what we can do is we can use these to say, okay, I have better acceleration, I have better high altitude performance, my climb is better, but I'm not going to be as nimble. So how do I work that into playing it? And how do I not fall into the trap of playing the Mark 14 like I would play a Mark 9? Well, the greatest mistake you can make in a Mark 14 is to fly it like a Mark 9 in terms of maneuverability. You cannot sustain the same amount of turning maneuvers that you can in the Mark 9 in the Mark 14. The aircraft will not turn the same way. It still turns very good, but if you play it like a Mark 9, where your main functionality is turning, you're going to find yourself getting killed a lot because the airplane's a lot heavier and it's a bit more sluggish. It also doesn't like to stall fight as much. So that kind of like hammerhead maneuver you can do in a Mark 9 when you get, you know, somebody under you at low speed, the Mark 14 is going to fight you a lot more on that. So the worst thing you can do in the 14 is get slow. You want to keep that plane fast. You want to treat it almost like it's a 109 and a Spitfire had a baby. It's still relatively maneuverable, but it's also got a lot more energy, and it's going to trade some of its, you know, parents' maneuverability for that energy. You always want to keep your speed in the Mark 14. It's your greatest attribute. Your high-end acceleration is very good. I like to think of playing the Mark 14 against your traditional opponents, your 109 G14s, your K4s, your 190 Doras, as fighting a Spitfire in a 109. So kind of put yourself in the other person's shoes. You know what I mean? If you're fighting a Mark 5 in your G2, you're going to try to use as much energy play as you possibly can, and that's what you try to do in the Mark 14. That's how you play the Mark 14. You don't let yourself get trapped into an extended maneuvering fight where the airplane's not going to be as happy. You want to use that speed, that horsepower, especially that climb rate. You can dive on a target and just climb away. Almost nothing can get you in a climb if you're fast. Your low-end climb acceleration, you will get caught out sometimes. But if you're fast and you just climb away, you're gone. And then you can roll in and you can recommit and you can play it like that. A lot of the energy tactics, the energy maneuvers that are the staples of, you know, the 109s, so your high yo-yo, stuff like that, those are things you want to, you know, master, because you're going to be diving on a lot of targets that are slower than you. You're going to want to know how to pull off while keeping as much energy and as much, you know, potential for energy in terms of altitude, while also, you know, giving yourself the best kill shot. So I would, you know, watch as many videos as you can about, you know, energy fighting. There's a lot of really good ones out there. And I would perfect those, because that's how you play the Mark 14. You really cannot play it like a traditional turn fighter in the way that the Mark 9 is. All right, that's enough of the nitty-gritty history and the nitty-gritty numbers. Just when you're flying these airplanes, keep in mind what you've learned here and what the differences are here. You know, the Mark 9 is a much better low-altitude airplane in terms of, you know, turning, dogfighting like that, but the Mark 14 is a much better high-altitude airplane with a better top speed and generally a better climb rate. So be actively aware of those advantages and using them to your benefit in a fight, and don't meddle the two airplanes. They're two very different airplanes with pretty different play styles, and if you try to make them into one and play them the same, you're going to suffer for it. Like I said earlier, I'm making this video with the assumption that the viewer already owns the Mark 14 and thus would know this, but just in case, there are two versions of the Mark 14 available in IL-2 Great Battles. The first is the earlier version with the Malcolm hood and the fully built up rear fuselage, and the second one is a version with a bubble canopy and a cut down rear fuselage. These aircraft are very similar in performance. The earlier one with the Malcolm hood is a bit faster and is also a bit more stable. It's the same concept that applies to the P-51B compared to the P-51D, but a lot of people swear by the added visibility offered by the bubble canopy. Alright, so first clip, I bounced two 109 K4s from behind. I'm going to lay into tail end Charlie, but I'm going to push through him. He ultimately goes down here. I don't know this. I'm full throttling it towards his flight lead. his flight lead goes to deck, that's fine for me, because that's a huge advantage for me, because he's pulling me further away from the guy who's now on my 6. I kill his pilot right here, pretty lucky, and I'm going to continue extending out and down because I want just a little bit more speed in case that K4 behind me isn't crippled. You can see I'm going to start rolling the airplane up and in. At this point I figured out the other one went down, but if he hadn't, I was in a position where I could have pulled up over this crippled airplane and come back down on him. I'm not trying to turn in the horizontal, I was going up to use my energy. Here's another example of how to use the energy in this airplane. I'm chasing down a 110, and granted it's a 110 on the deck, but he's going to make a critical decision here that's going to give me a massive energy advantage. That, you know, I already have one because I'm a much better airplane, but watch this. He pulls hard into me, and I give too much rudder, and I miss my first shots, but my second salvo saws off his wing, and I cut right back into him, and I'm going over his nose in case he's still alive, because I know he won't have any more energy, and I can tighten down really hard and come up and over him, but I see he's bailing out, so I dive out under him, and that's the end of that. Next one, I pick up this 109 attacking a friendly airfield, and I'm not pulling all the way back on the stick. I'm giving a nice broad turns, I'm keeping my energy up here, and I'm just waiting for an opportunity where I feel good to take the shot. I'm not forcing myself into a shot, and I'm not forcing myself into really hard turns like you might with a Mark 9. He's going in here. I'm okay just tailing him here. I don't want it. This is an awful deflection shot to take, so I'm just going to keep tailing him, and I get comfortable with this one. Actually, this shot makes me feel good. I hit his oil radiator here, I think, and he's going to keep purling, and I feel good enough about my energy state where I know that this airplane, the Mark 14, will really pull, so I'm going to match with him. We're going to hit him with some 20s, and into the deck he goes. So, yet again, just waiting for that opportune shot, conserving my energy until I get that opportunity, and then taking it. You can see I don't dive in on him. I keep a little bit more of an open angle to get on his tail. If I pulled really hard in there, I probably would have locked up. I probably wouldn't have been able to pull hard enough, and I would have gone into the deck. So, instead of rolling in hard like you might with a Mark 9, keeping a little bit more of an open angle, and just searching for that opportunity, but also keeping your energy up. He's doing a great job for me because he's moving a lot in the dive, which means that I am constantly building energy. I'm not having to expend any until I want to. So I want to right now because I'm converting some of my energy to get guns on, and that's good for me because it means that I have less of a chance of overshooting, and I'm also getting some chances on him. Ultimately, I pull him into the gun sight, and he goes down. Super easy kill. The next one here is I spotted a Dora. Now, a Dora is a fearsome opponent. This thing, even on the deck, is pretty fast, but I'm going to show you how fast the Mark 14 can be. So we see him taking a couple shots at a friendly P-47. He is going to extend out. Good choice from him. I was impressed with this guy. He flew pretty well. Actually, I think this is Cuban Spy, who's relatively well known within the combat box community. Yet again, pulling into him, I'm pulling in and over him because I really want that energy advantage that this is giving me. See how I gave a little bit more of an open turn and it's poised me in behind him, and I'm not locking up and I'm not overspeeding, and so now I'm right on his tail and I'm going to be chasing him down. I'm going to start opening up with some shots. We get a hit into his oil. I think I also get a fuel leak here. Right here there's going to be a very sketchy moment. I'm going to almost hit the ground, little bit greedy right there, but look, I'm coming up. I'm going up and over. I don't want to overshoot. I'm going to do a bit of a high yo-yo. I have the energy advantage, and I want to keep it that way. I want to do whatever I can to maintain my energy advantage while also burning a little bit of it to keep me on his tail. So I'm going to go up, over, roll in, roll back down on him. Super easy maneuver. Super simple. We're back in on his tail. He's going to make a poor choice here to burn a lot of energy. He's going to go vertical. And right here, look at this, just a little bit of rudder, pull him into the gun sight, saw his wing off. Look at that vertical. That airplane is just holding energy so well. It doesn't stall out here until I cut the throttle and give it some rudder. And then I'm going to track him back in because I want to make sure he's dead, but he bails out. Good fight. This thing is an absolute beast. I tore down on that guy. Granted, he still has a bomb on him, but this is a fast airplane. So just using that energy, that high yo-yo right there, really big, going up and over. Here's the first person. You can see a little bit what I'm doing here. My track IR and my VR are causing my game to crash, so I'm using a hat stick on the top of my throttle, but just up and over him. I'm not going to pull directly onto him because I see where he's going, right? I know he's going to intersect me, so I don't need to pull into him. I can save some energy and I can keep my altitude advantage. Just rolling over, nice gentle, nothing too aggressive, nothing too aggressive yet. Just slotting in on his 6 right here. We're going to pick him up. We're going to start taking some shots because I'm feeling good about it. Then back up, back up. No need to stay with him on the deck. Back up. Energy advantage. I want the altitude. That's the biggest thing. Here comes that greedy moment. Ooh, that was close. Almost had me, but I'm going back up. Check to see which side he slipped under. I know what side he's on now. Rolling the airplane up, over, keep a track on him. Give her a little bit of rudder, a little bit of roll. Just gentle, gentle. Look how gentle we are with it. And just back down. Don't have to play aggressive. I know I have the engine power here. He's going to have to make a move or I'm going to run him down. He's going to make the move here. He's going to pull up. That's fine. I'm going to pull a little bit more on the stick than I normally would. He's going to cut in. Little bit of rudder there. Easiest deflection shot. Good flight to him. Nice kill. Yet again, just a third person view because it really helps to iterate how almost passive you want to play this plane until you can play it super aggressive to get a kill. Like I see him here, he's cutting under me. I'm not going to try to follow that turn. I'm not going to try to roll into him and pull right onto him. I'm going to go back up. I'm going to get a little bit more of my altitude that I can convert into some speed in a minute, and I'm just going to reset it. I'm not going to take a high G turn and throw myself into the ground. This thing isn't as responsive as a Mark 9. I just can't do that. But I do have the energy power to do this. I can dip my nose, I can build my speed up, and I can chase this guy down. At no point during this fight am I ever in a low energy situation. And there's something to be said for the fact that he maybe didn't see me. I don't think he did see me until I was right on his tail. But even if he had, I really don't think that there was any way in which I would have lost so much energy as to become in a low energy state during this fight. Even if he saw me and started to actively combat maneuver against me as soon as, let's say, he cut under me initially, there was almost no way he would win unless I made a major mistake of, letting him, reverse me or something. This fight, I think, is probably the prime example of how to use your energy and how to use your patience to pick up a kill. Then, of course, voila, the fruits of your labor. Alright, I've kept everybody for long enough. So, everybody have a good day. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something from it. And I hope you will be able to put
what you've learned here into flying your Mark 14 and to getting better results out of it. Have a good day, everybody.